Welcome to the New Chemist podcast. We're glad you're listening. Feel free to download this podcast on Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. Here on the New Chemist, we discuss chemistry, which simply put is the science of change, as well as the other sciences, careers, community, research, and COVID-19. Welcome to the New Chemist podcast. We're so glad you're listening. Feel free to download this podcast on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and a variety of other platforms. Here on the New Chemist, we discuss chemistry, which simply put is the science of change, as well as the other sciences, careers, community, research, and Nobel Prize lectures in chemistry and the analysis of their speeches. We're happy you're tuning in. My guest today is Dr. Trevor Johnson. Thanks for joining me today. It is so good to hear from you. Just briefly, I'll inform my audience about you. So, Trevor Johnson. Trevor Johnson is a budding, developing Bahamian leader. He has completed his Bachelor of Education with Biology and Biological Sciences at the University of the Bahamas. He completed a Master's of Science in Climate Change from UE, University of West Indies, Cave Hill, and he completed his PhD in Crisis, Emergency, and Disaster Management. He has also served as a strategic advisor, a climate change specialist and consultant. He has served as a founder of the Bahamas Climate Change Campaign, and he has also served as a disaster risk management consultant at the IDB. Trevor is on a good path to making a difference in the Bahamas. It is so good to have him on today as a guest. So, Trevor, what have been your long-standing interest in the field of science?
Hi, thank you, David. First, it's so great to be here with you. And yes, I've had a very, very long interest in science. At one point in my life, I think I wanted to be a doctor, but that quickly shifted when I fell in love with teaching. When I completed high school, I love science, and I really wanted to share that love. And when I felt that teaching was one of the best ways to share that love about science. So I taught high school for about 3 years. And then I switched more so from the biological sciences. I was very interested in biology, especially about the human anatomy. I switched from that and I went into environmental sciences. I became very interested in climate change, and I did my PhD in disaster management. While disaster management is a very, very interdisciplinary field, it's very much so more aligned on the social sciences side of things. But I've always had a love for science, always.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I've looked at the megatrends, and one of the megatrends involves there being a heavy emphasis on climate change and integrating policies that are able to mitigate some of the changes occurring in our climate. So yeah, I think you will find a lot of utility in your degree, or with your degree and with your training. So how do you maintain view of the bigger picture in your career and in your life in general? So when you face obstacles and challenges, which I'm certain you have faced, what have you done? What toolkit do you use? What strategies do you employ in order for you to keep a good perspective or a healthy, holistic view of what's going on? What do you do, especially for your academic pursuits?
In terms of my academic pursuits, as cliche as it sounds, I was always a very hard worker. Okay. I was always one of those persons who was driven by passion. And I believe that once you found something that you were passionate about, that made the obstacles a bit more, they didn't come up as much, because, I didn't have to deal with issues such as fatigue or not doing what I wanted to do, because I was doing what I loved. So that helped me a lot, on this path. But of course, like you said, there would have been barriers along the way. And I think with those barriers, whenever I experience them, I think the first thing I would do is I would often pray. I come from a very strong faith background. I'm Christian in terms of religion, but I think I have I know I have a very strong faith in God. So that definitely that helped me along the way. And then two, I try not to necessarily look at the negative in things. When things happen, sometimes I see them as a lesson. Rather than curse a lesson. Like I look at the situations and more so, what is this trying to teach me? What skill is this trying to, get out of me? Or what am I going to learn from the situation? Of course, you're a bit down when you get disappointments or barriers or obstacles.
Yeah,
but
that's human.
But when we focus on the negative, we can't focus on the negative too long.
You
have to necessarily look at it as in terms of how am I going to learn from this experience, or how is this going to make me a better person?
Yeah, I agree. So you almost seeing your experiences with a degree of pedagogical value or teaching. What can this teach me? What skill set do I need to employ, or what skill set can I even gain in the circumstance I could carry with me to the next challenge or next opportunity that I'm going to encounter? So that's very true, and I too have faith in. I too have my faith perspective, my Christian faith perspective, and I could say it definitely helps me as well. So how have you been adaptive and creative in the field of science? I'm sure you in teaching I've heard a lot of discussions about education, so I'm sure in your classroom you probably had to employ a degree of creativity or adapting different types of content to make the students engage. So can you give an example of ways you have been adaptive and creative even in your teaching or in your learning when it comes to science and disasters and climate change and disaster management?
Okay, great. So in terms of being a high school teacher, I definitely had to learn to adapt. Because I was a student, I always got science very easy. Something I love, something that I always did. But when I began to teach high school, I realized that everyone, as expected, did not share that love. A lot of students didn't like science because in terms of what science had become in the modern education system, a lot of teachers necessarily chalk and talk with science, especially with biology. Students get a lot of notes, they associate science with a lot of writing, a lot of memorization, things like that. But I tried to take that away from it. And in particular, health science. Health science is a lot of content, especially for junior high students, learning about the different body systems, cells and tissues and all of those types of things. Those are things that can become very overwhelming, especially for 7th, 8th, or 9th grader. So what I learned in terms of how to make my lessons more interesting was I learned about this 5E approach when I did my bachelor degree, and I felt like that helped a lot in terms of you engage students, you allow them to explore, then you explain, then you expand, and then you evaluate. And for me, where I really saw my students come to life was in the exploration phase. I'll give an example. Whenever I would teach a unit on blood is a very hard topic for students to grasp. Why? Because when they look at blood, all they see is red, liquid blood. Trying to tell students that blood is comprised of plasma and cells, different things, is very difficult. So what I usually do is I would, let students actually make blood. So what we'd do is I'd get water, I'd put a little yellow dye in it to represent plasma, and then I'd usually soak Cheerios in red food coloring so that when they put the Cheerios inside the liquid itself, it becomes red. And then they understand that hemoglobin is found in red blood cells and it helps to give blood that color. So it's just activities like that help students to see the connection between what science is and how you can actually see it. It's real, it's here, it's there, and it makes the learning process more meaningful. As a 27, 28-year-old, or even as adults, certain concepts are very easy for us to grasp. When you're talking to 11-year-old who, when they cut themselves, they only see this red liquid oozing, and trying to explain to them that you have platelets and plasma and red blood cells and different type of white blood cells running through your veins, that could become a very, very complex, topic for them to grasp. So what I usually try to do is have some sort of engagement and exploration activity so the students could see the content, so that they can experience the content and they don't necessarily become a passive audience, but rather they become active participants.
Oh, that's good. That's very good. Yeah, I've heard about the 5E method too. I tried to integrate that in one of the books that I'm working on and updating in terms of high school chemistry. So yeah, So I've heard of that approach. But yeah, that's very good when it comes to discussing the composition of blood in terms of formed elements and plasma and all this other good stuff. Yeah, that's very Very good. So, how did you seek or find the right environment for you to thrive scientifically and intellectually? How do you go about finding a good institution that works for you? And how are you sure when you're searching? How do you seek and search through to find the environment that works for you, not only scientifically but also intellectually, that allows you to grow and develop as a person and also as a professional? So, what do you do? How do you go about the process?
So I'll give an example in terms of when I was doing my PhD, in terms of when looking for a place to study, in terms of how I found my university. I did my bachelor's degree in the Bahamas at home. I did my master's degree in Barbados, regionally focused. At that point, after completing my master's, I knew I wanted an international focus. The area that I'm interested in is the environment, climate change, disaster management. And I think, especially coming from small island developing states, it's very important that you have a regional perspective and you have a global view as well. And I wanted that. So that's why I really made my decision with the United States. Now, in terms of when looking at a program, there are very few programs in the United States that offers a PhD in disaster management. That's the first thing. As I would have mentioned, disaster management is a very interdisciplinary field, meaning that it's even expressed in where these degree programs are housed. For example, some universities, they would have a PhD in disaster management, for example, in the engineering department, where others would have it in the public policy. Some would have it in sociology.
Okay.
And so that just goes to show you how interdisciplinary this field is. And what I did was, when looking, I didn't want a specialization in a field. So I didn't want a disaster management degree that was, or a PhD in engineering that was specialized in disaster management, or public policy PhD that was in disaster management. I wanted a full PhD degree in disaster management.
Okay.
And why I wanted that, because in my working experience between my master's and my PhD, I had a gap year or two. And I started to work with my country's Ministry of Disaster Preparedness Management and Reconstruction.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that there was so much things that we did not know. And I know that knowledge could not be filled without having a deep and intimate understanding with the body of knowledge associated with disaster management. That was my impetus for doing a PhD. Okay. In terms of why I wanted a pure degree in disaster management, I looked at how I found it. I looked at the department's mission, vision, and understanding. That gives you a very, very clear understanding of how a department views a particular academic discipline, especially one such as disaster management, which is a very young and emerging academic discipline. Okay. It is indeed an academic discipline. It isn't as mature as areas like chemistry or sociology or psychology. Mm-hmm. But when you're pursuing fields in this area, it's very important you have a very good understanding of how departments view disaster management.
Yeah.
What are their research interests? And I am more so interested in terms of disaster management. I'm not as interested in, for example, the understanding risk, or for example, climate adaptation.
Yeah.
I am more so interested in understanding the human experiences after disasters and before disasters. I'm interested in understanding what makes individuals and households recover from events.
Okay,
what makes communities recovers. Yeah. And for example, I want to understand, what makes a person truly prepared. Is it canned goods, water bottle, or is it something else? And the literature tells us something else. So I'm very interested in understanding the human experiences, how humans create with vulnerability, how we cope with them, and how we interact with them. Yeah. And so, those are some of the things that really got me going in terms of how I found an institution that worked for me in the realm of, in my terms of my PhD and other studies.
Wow, that's good, dude. That instantly reminded me of a book that I went through by the Harvard Business Review, Mental Toughness. And also this book by Frederick Flock that I'm still working on, The Resilience. Resilience book by Frederick Flock. But yeah, dude, one of the things that book talked about, especially I'm talking about the Harvard Business Review book on mental toughness, one of the things it talked about is how sometimes many successful individuals have viewed the challenging experiences as crucibles. So for example, it was not just a hard experience, but they also saw the opportunity to be refined, to skill up. So I was listening to this masterclass by Indra Nui, and she talked about how you have to develop a hip pocket skill. So you have to develop the skill set that you can, because when you come to a job, she made the point how you arrive on the job, the prestigious school that you just came from is after a few months or so, that's yesterday's news. People are now interested in what skill, what knowledge base is this person bringing to the table that we can use within our organization. So yeah, dude, I think having the capacity to be resilient, especially in challenging times or times of uncertainty, is a very, very valuable skill. And I think many times we talk about post-traumatic stress, and that sometimes occurs as a result of disasters, but the book also mentioned, this is the Mental Toughness book by Harvard Business Review, it also mentioned post-traumatic growth, how for some individuals, after going through a hard experience, their growth is very different compared to other individuals. It's very different. And they have developed skills that they carry with them that's on a higher tier and allows them to function at a higher level. Because I'm sure you may have, but I know I have, read of stories of people who go through some really challenging times and they produce like seminal works, like they produce like high quality research or high quality findings or high quality literature that makes impacts and indelible images in people's minds for generations beyond them. Even after they're gone, their work is still making an impression. Definitely. So yeah, dude, I think that's very important, being able to understand what and how do people respond before and after disasters. I think that body of knowledge that you're working on, or even that you have worked on, I think it'll be useful, especially for us in the Bahamas. So yeah, what have been your most effective and impactful ideas to date?
So in terms of my most, I'd probably start off with education. In terms of when I taught in a very, what word to use? I wouldn't want to say rural community, a low socioeconomic background community. And one of the programs that existed before I started to teach was Save Our 7th Graders program. Okay. Because we realized that we had students coming into the 7th grade. They were very, very bright. But by the time as they got to like 9th and 10th grade, they were still bright, but their work ethic, they were not as hardworking as they were when they first entered high school. So we started to Save Our 7th Graders program, and a part of it was that, some students in the 7th grade would take the health science BJC at 7th grade level. Now, when I first came at 8 Mile Orkai at the school, what they did was they would select maybe about 5 to 10 students from the top set. In the 3 years that I taught, I told them no, that I wanted to take the entire top set to BJC in the 7th grade. It didn't make sense picking 5 or 26 or 27 children to take the whole class, everybody, those who are extremely high flyers, those who are kind of average, and those who were, they needed a bit more help. I wanted to take all of them to do it. And in the 3 years that, I took those students to Health Science BJC, we got 100% A to D passes and about 95% A to C passes and 50% A's at the 7th grade. Wow. I think that, thank you for that. I think that's a very remarkable accomplishment given the background of that school and what's associated with it. In terms of as a professional, as a disaster management professional, consultant, I think one of my greatest accomplishments so far would be, I'm currently working, because I can't speak on behalf of my organization, I'll just say that I'm currently working on a project, a very, very important project in the space of disaster management, and has to deal with how we professionalize disaster management. How do we build capacity in this space in the Bahamas? We live in a very low-lying, vulnerable, place in the world. The Bahamas is very vulnerable. It's very low-lying. And through that project, we're currently working with higher education partners to see how best we can meet and fill capacity gaps in this space. And I think that's a great contribution to disaster management, considering the fact, of our vulnerabilities, our realities, and then there's a clear human capacity gap in country.
Yeah. So that's a very interesting point you make. And this is the thing, Trevor. One thing that I've come to see and come to understand, especially by discussions with other people and also my own reading, disaster, from my understanding, your ability to cope with a challenge or a disaster or some major crisis, it also your education does come into play, not just in terms of your ability to accrue financial resources, but also your ability to work through the challenge and prepare for the challenge, and also do the work after the challenge to get back up to on your feet, and to be functioning. And I think when it comes to capacity building, it may require, and this is just my suggestion, it may require developing skill sets at the associate's degree level or certificate level until you're able to progress towards a full-fledged bachelor's degree or master's degree at a university in the Bahamas.
Or even a minor.
A minor, yeah, even a minor. I think we have to start small, and we have to improve on that small initiative until we could really build capacity to the point where we have those higher tier degree programs. But yeah, dude, I think that's very important. I think it's very, very important. So how have you maintained vision and teamwork in your environment? How do you maintain those goals, those ideals in your workspace? How do you keep perspective in terms of the overarching goal the organization has set, and also collaborating with people? How do you keep that in check?
I think one thing I've learned is in terms of, just whole collaboration, teamwork, and everyone functioning as one well-oiled machine. One thing I've learned across time is that you have to recognize that people are different, and we must be okay with working with people who are very different from us. Different in terms of personalities, different in terms of strengths and weaknesses. When you have a team, everyone is not going to be good at everything, and some persons are going to be weaker on certain things than others. It's very important to identify the strengths of each person, and you allow them to work in that space where they're strongest at. And you don't necessarily put people in where they're weakest. You find someone who is strong in that area and who can possibly help them. So I think what I've learned too is, really understanding your team members. That plays a big role. You have to understand who you're working with. And sometimes people are not comfortable sharing what they're strong. Not with their strong. People are very comfortable with that.
Oh yeah.
In my experience, people are very uncomfortable talking about their weaknesses.
Yeah.
And I think, one thing I learned, a skill that I would have, learned when I worked in another organization, was when we had to work together, especially on big projects. One of the things is I'd always ask people, what is it that you don't like to do? What is something that you're weak at? We always began with that. Why? Because then we knew simply which areas not to give a person or where not to put their focus. Because at that point, if you're not moving intentionally in terms of understanding each other, then you're only going to have issues later on. So it's really good to understand, which areas persons, may not be as strong in. So one, you may be able to partner them with someone who is strong in that area so they can gradually develop those skills with time. And then two, initially, especially if you need the project come off the ground in a very quick time frame, you usually want to put persons who are stronger in certain areas to complete certain tasks.
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree. Because, I can even think of certain aspects of analysis, chemical analysis, where I know I can improve on. Even case in point, I'll be quite frank with you. When it comes to advanced mass spec, of course, I can run through advanced mass spec analysis. Even some COSY and those different types of NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance spectra. Those types of things require me to take a second look, to do a little bit more work to really understand what's going on when you deal with a specific molecule. When it comes to running through mechanisms, running through retrosynthetic analysis, running through a nice modular synthetic procedure, those things I could do. Just give me the schema, give me the reagents, let me run through it, let me review it beforehand, and we could go. We game.
Yep.
I'll come in clutch, that type of thing. but the reality is there are other areas where I have to spend more time, and I have to get help from other people because they have more. Not only do they find that area more enjoyable, they also have more skill in that area.
Skills,
And
yes.
I think we have to be. I think you bring up a very important point. We have to be okay with sharing the areas that we are not as. You could say it differently. You could say not as strong in on your skills are not as pronounced in
Yep.
that area, or
Agreed.
you are not as agile in that area. We have to be okay with sharing that because I think growth and authenticity are rarely delinked. You have to be aware of yourself and you have to be authentic when you're trying to grow as an individual, especially in a professional
I
community.
love that.
Yeah.
Yes, I love that.
Yeah, dude. So, why did you choose North Dakota State University to do your PhD at? You just spoke about it earlier. Was it also the social environment too, or was it primarily the academic emphasis that played a role in you deciding NDSU as your university?
So I would say it was two things. It was, I studied in the Bahamas, I studied in the Caribbean. I wanted a different experience. I wanted a different exposure. I am a black man and I lived in a predominantly white state. I'm from the Caribbean, hot climate. I lived in a very cold state.
Yeah.
I knew those things going straight out the gate. I knew what I was going to, face with. But I think in that experience, it would have taught me a lot. So that was one. I was open to the challenge. I was open to experiencing something different. Coming out of my comfort zone. I felt like I needed that to grow a bit more. And that's the first thing. And then secondly, it was really the academics. The Department of Emergency Management and Disaster Science at North Dakota State University, in my opinion, is very phenomenal. In terms of how they understand, how they view disaster management, and of course their philosophy. They're very big on teaching, research, and practice. So for example, while I taught, I did research. I did a lot of engagement with practitioners. I worked with the Inter-American Development Bank while a student. That was hard to do, but I did it. And I also taught. I taught emergencies, disasters, and catastrophes for I think about 5 semesters. And when that balance, to me was ideal for a field like disaster management. You needed to have that, that trio, the holy trinity, research, theory, research, practice, and teaching. Those three things go hand in hand. And when I saw that, I loved that. And then secondly, North Dakota State University is a R1 institution, very research intensive. So I knew that going to that institution, I would have that support in terms of being in a rigorous research environment, and that it was.
Yeah, that's good, dude. That's good. So yeah, dude, I completely agree in that, sometimes you mentioned how you worked at the IDB even as a student and it was you said it was hard, but I'm sure you benefited significantly from that experience. Am I right?
Yes, of course.
So even when it came to me in graduate school, dude, I worked on the podcast, I worked on other things as well. I volunteered, I helped out with the foundations, the science and mathematics program, the Science Summer Institute. There are a lot of things, it's almost like when you understand yourself and you understand your capacity to handle certain things and you have your self-care measures in place, your boundaries in place, it's good to push, it's good to pursue those goals, it's good to do a little bit extra to make sure at the end of the day you have the toolkit of skills that you want, and also the breadth of experiences, both academic, personal, and social, that you would have wanted during those 4 or 5 years you did in some training program. So yeah, that's good. So what advice do you have to those wanting to pursue the field you're currently working in, and what has been some of the most beneficial advice you have received?
Persons who are interested in pursuing a degree in disaster management, whether it's at the bachelor's, master's, or doctoral level, I think one advice I would tell them is make sure that you really look and you understand how your department or your unit views disaster management. That's going to be very important. Okay. Like I said, some universities house these degree programs in sociology departments. Some of them stand alone, some of them in geography departments. And where they're positioned is heavily going to influence their curriculum. I would tell anyone to pay very, very keen attention to that. I can't tell someone where to go. I mean, I wouldn't tell someone run away from engineering or run away from geography or run away from the public admin people. But it's truly your interest. What do you want to do? And where you see yourself going. That's the first thing.
Yeah.
Because when you have an emerging field like disaster management, it's going to take a while for everyone to get on the same accord in terms of how we philosophically view the field. That in and of itself is an entire podcast, and it is a conversation that academics continue to have in the literature, especially those engaged in disaster research and especially disaster management, higher education research. That is a podcast in and of itself. So I would tell people to be aware of that. Be aware of the emerging nature of the field. The second thing, in terms of what advice that I've gotten, I think the advice that stayed with me, that really stuck with me was one of my supervisors, actually my supervisor at the IDB. We had just completed a very, very successful symposium. We had gotten the success, we had restored client trust. We had done exceptionally well. The team had done very well. And one thing my supervisor told me was that she told me never to lose my human touch. She always told me that regardless of how many degrees you get, how many job offers you get, she reminded me to stay humble, to remain as humble as I was.
Yeah.
And because when you remain humble, when you keep that human touch, people are going to want to work with you more. You make things very easier to do. And, it's just going to be better for a team. A lot of times, and I say this as a PhD, some PhDs are the most difficult people to work with. And I say that as a PhD, so whoever has an issue with it, they can come to me personally. But PhDs can sometimes be the most difficult people to work with simply because they're not grounded. Yeah. And I think, that really stuck with me because from my personal experiences working with some people, especially academicians, it can be very, very difficult. So, my advice, and I give that to anyone out there, stay grounded. Always be open to hearing the views and opinions of others. You don't know everything. You'll never know anything. Learn to respect the opinions of each other.
I agree. That's very important. And from my faith perspective, it talks about God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. And that plays out in a lot of ways. Your ability to interact with people and to interact well with people. Humility is a large component in that. And humility is not bashing yourself or downing your skills. Humility is having an authentic and realistic outlook on your strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities presented to you. So yeah, dude, I think that's very good. That's a very important point. It's important for you to consider, like, as you're pursuing a field, and this is a perspective I gained as I went through it. So you don't have to understand everything that we say in this episode for the first listen. You can feel free to re-listen as much as you need to. So this is the thing. You have skills, you have time, and you also have value. And those are like three axes, if you will. You have to think about, how do the skills I'm getting now translate over time? Will they still be as valuable to me and to others as they are now in the next 5, 10, or 15 years? That's why climate change is such a hot topic, because it's such a hot area to get skills in or have a degree of competency in, because trends are leaning towards that heavily in terms of investing in climate change infrastructure, climate change resilience, having an understanding of what it takes to be resilient, all of those things, given the current situation on our planet. And then also, like you said, it's important to understand how your field is emerging and how it's burgeoning and how it's developing, and what are like those hot topics, if you will, in your field. Like in biology and chemistry, like having an understanding of what we call the ohm, like the genome, the lipidome, the proteome, which basically is referring to the entire profile of a subclass of macromolecules, or a class of macromolecules like proteins, lipids, fats, all those things. That's very in a way it's hot, and it's people are now looking at the perspective, or looking at diseases from the perspective of, how does my understanding of the lipidome translate into me making an impact with this specific pathology? How is my understanding of a specific subset of the genome within this organism complement to me having some ability to determine some type of drug pathway or
Awesome.
some cycle or some function in the body? How can
Yes.
how can I implement some loss of function, mutation, those types of things? And all of those things they're coming from like this impetus that the genome, proteome, metabolome, lipidome is providing. So yeah, that's very important. But yeah, Trevor, thank you so much for joining me today. It was so good to have you as a guest. Two, three, and for 5. Biochemistry is the chemistry of life. With C, N, O, H, calcium, PKS at 95%, the dry weight best. Yet, most of the organism can falter since they are 70% water. Theories on origin postulate and say that life today arose from simple organic molecules. Polymerization of them is a fact when completed self-replication capacity intact. Compartmentalization, membrane formation, endosymbiosis for prokaryotic to eukaryotic formation. Look at the mitochondria and we can see evidence of Margulis ideas most definitely. With the kernel, U before the kernel, pro with the membrane, U with no membrane bound pro, yo, BAE, bacteria, archaea, and eukarya, I say, BAE. Eukaryotes are like your animal and plant and fungi cells. Prokaryotes like your bacteria and archaea. Bacteria and archaea are similar outwardly, but different inwardly. Let's recap with a thermodynamics wrap. First law states, never destroyed or created, energy is always conserved. Continuing on to the next verse. Second law states, learn about entropy at least from the basis of the micro state. In the system, it tends to increase. Constant, as this verse, is the entropy of the universe. Third law states, completely zero Kelvin, or absolute crystalline solid at zero. I'll tell you a thing or two about the ideas of Josiah Gibbs. Ideas. You know who? Josiah Gibbs. The energy to do work. Gibbs free energy. When positive, non-favored. When negative, favored. Enthalpy. When positive, endo. When negative, exo. So, I will dare you to do your very best. But before there, let's talk about Le Chatelier. If a system is at equilibrium and one of the parameters is changed, the system will shift so as to restore the equilibrium, since it is adored, respected, controlled, redirected, ideally simple and steady state. Yeah, that is very great. Quick maths, oh yeah. Quick facts, oh yeah. Quick review with you know who. Mitochondria is like the Bank of America, but it produces energy, currencies to help the cell run efficiently. The processes, the cycles, the paths, it helps the cell run its machinery efficiently. Let's talk about the main big chief, the nucleus, the cellular CEO or executive branch. It ensures regulation and successful replication. It ensures good maintenance of good information. It ensures the blueprint is followed correctly with the other members helping cooperatively. The executive branch, your nucleus, ensuring organization on every cytoskeletal branch. Golgi, I am the producer of the PTMs, post-translational modifications with your elegant glycosylations. Ribosome satisfactory, the protein synthesis factory. SER, smooth endoplasmic reticulum, lipid modification, synthesis of steroid hormones, and it is in the detoxification zone. RER, rough endoplasmic reticulum, modifies, packages, and transports those proteins in that cellular cord. Centrioles shine in anaphase during that replicative cellular dance. The vacuole, you may see it in a microscope, in a cell by chance. Cytoskeleton, keeping the show intact with kinesin, dynein, and myosin, titin, like that. These help with that vesicular transport race. They help to keep the cytoskeletal members in place, dynamic as they are some of the main stars. Let's look a little closer with those glycogen granules in the occasional cellular space. Hold on, let's keep pace. Testing 2, 3, and 5. Biochemistry is the chemistry of life. Intermolecular force, covalent bonds, protein levels of structure. Linear is one level with those amino acid chains. Primary, that is called, and that is a fact. Moving up with the beta strands, then sheets and the alpha helices, they meet. Secondary then has made its stop. 3D structure, and the tertiary just dropped with those subunits. Most definitely, we have finally reached the quaternary. Testing 2, 3, and 4, 5. Biochemistry is the chemistry of life. DNA with its adenine, deoxyribose, and phosphate. Hydrogen bonding to that time midylate. Then with the G, triply hydrobonded to the C. Triply hydrogen bonded to the C. The guanosine, phosphate, cytosine, and phosphate imparts the chief nucleic acid is made of nucleotides from the DNA with the histones to the beads on a string. Your nucleosomes to the chromatin, making your chromosomes order, regulation, and your signaling cascades S, G1, G2, and M. Testing 2, 3, and 4, 5. Biochemistry is the chemistry of life. Water on the wall with the dipole and dipole. Bonds with the hydrogen bonds you see. Its intermolecular bonds elegantly. High heat of fusion, just think, allows water to act as a heat sink. A high heat of vaporization. IMFs complement. Dissolution of most polar compounds, and its ice is less dense than liquid water. 70% of the organism, and yes, they still can falter. Testing 2, 3, 4, and 5. Biochemistry is the chemistry of life. Testing 2, 3, and 4, 5. Biochemistry is the chemistry of life. Thanks for listening. We're glad you were able to tune into this podcast. Once again, this is The New Chemist, where we discuss chemistry, which simply put is the science of change, as well as the other sciences, careers, community, research, and COVID-19. Thanks again for listening. Note, the views on this podcast represent those of my guests and I.